Disturbing details in the murder of an 18-year-old here in Tolleson. Police telling us her body was found in one of these apartments belonging to a person she was dating.
I can't imagine who would do that to her. I don't understand.
The apartment was quiet when investigators arrived. Not the kind of quiet that feels peaceful, the kind that feels wrong. Nothing appeared disturbed at first glance. No shattered windows, no forced entry. Just an ordinary door in an ordinary building, in an ordinary neighborhood. But inside, something had already told them this was no longer a missing person case. Hours earlier, this had been treated as a search, a routine effort to locate someone who hadn't answered their phone, someone who, by all accounts, had simply gone to meet another person. There was no history between them, no long relationship, no complicated backstory, just a conversation, a few messages, an agreement to meet, the kind of interaction that happens every day, thousands of times, without consequence. And yet, somewhere between that first message and this moment, something had gone terribly wrong. Investigators began documenting the scene carefully, methodically. Every object mattered. Every detail could explain how a brief encounter had escalated into something far more serious. Because cases like this don't begin with violence. They begin with normalcy, with trust, with the assumption that the person on the other side of the screen is exactly who they claim to be. So the question facing investigators wasn't just what happened here. It was how something so ordinary could lead to something irreversible. How does a short interaction between two people who barely knew each other, end in a tragedy that would soon stretch far beyond this single room? To understand that, we have to go back to the very beginning. Before anyone realized this meeting would be the last. Before this case became an investigation. Before detectives and evidence markers. There was just a young woman living her everyday life in Tolleson, Arizona. Friends described Yessenia Gabriella Norman as being in that familiar stage between adolescence and full independence, making plans, thinking about the future, navigating responsibilities that come with becoming an adult. It was a time filled with ordinary routines, checking messages, talking with friends, balancing personal life with new opportunities, the kind of daily rhythm that rarely draws attention because it looks like everyone else's, and like millions of others, part of that routine included connecting with people online. Today, digital conversations are woven into how relationships begin. A message turns into a conversation. A conversation turns into familiarity. And familiarity, even when brief, can feel like trust. Nothing about this interaction stood out as alarming. There were no immediate red flags, no dramatic warning signs. Just two people who had recently started talking, deciding to meet face to face. To anyone looking from the outside, it would have seemed like an ordinary decision, one made every day in cities across the country. But what makes cases like this so unsettling is exactly that normality. Because when investigators later retraced these early moments, they didn't find chaos. They found something far more deceptive. They found a situation that, at first glance, looked completely safe. And that's what makes what happened next so difficult to comprehend. On January 15th, 18-year-old Yessenia Gabriella Norman left her apartment in Phoenix, Arizona, expecting what many believed was a routine meetup. She was going to see a man she had met online through a social media dating platform. There was nothing outwardly alarming about that day. No sign it would become the last time anyone heard from her. She walked out, expecting to come back, but she never did. At first, the silence didn't raise panic. Hours passed, then a full day. Messages stopped going through. Calls rang unanswered. What seemed like a delay slowly turned into something far more concerning. 4 days later, after still hearing nothing, her roommate reported her missing, officially triggering a search. That's when investigators began retracing her final movements. Digital evidence quickly became central to the case. Detectives worked to reconstruct where she went, who she met, and what happened after she left home. Authorities would later determine she had gone to meet 27-year-old Randel Basilio Santillan, the man connected to the apartment where crime unfolded. Then came the discovery that shifted the investigation from a missing person case to a homicide. Police later found Norman stabbed to death inside an apartment in Tolleson, Arizona, a suburb on the western edge of the Phoenix metropolitan area. The location where she had gone was the same place where her life ended. Authorities said the suspect left Arizona shortly after the killing, traveling more than 1,000 miles away before being located and arrested in Biloxi, Mississippi. Once detectives identified who Yessenia had gone to meet, the direction of the case began to change. The man was 27-year-old Randel Basilio Santillan. Investigators moved quickly to contact him. In cases like this, early interviews are critical. They help establish timelines, clarify last interactions, confirm whether the missing person left voluntarily. But when officers tried to locate him, they couldn't. He wasn't answering calls. He wasn't at the residence. And according to early investigative findings, he had already left the area. That sudden absence immediately raised concern. In criminal investigations, unexpected travel, especially right after someone is reported missing, is treated as a significant red flag, not proof of guilt, but behavior that demands urgent attention. Detectives began shifting resources. What had started as a welfare check was now being handled with the caution of a potential violent crime. They retraced every known movement, reviewed communication records, and focused on one key location tied to her final hours: an apartment in Tolleson, Arizona, the same place she had gone that day, the same place investigators now needed to examine far more closely. Because by this point, the question was no longer simply, where is she? It had become something far more serious. What happened inside that apartment, and why did the man she met leave so quickly afterward? By the time investigators arrived in Tolleson, this was no longer just a missing person case. It had become something far more serious. Police were led to an apartment near 91st Avenue, just south of Interstate 10, where officers began processing what would become the central crime scene of the investigation. Inside that apartment, detectives made the discovery they had feared. 18-year-old Yessenia Gabriella Norman was found dead, confirming that she had never returned after leaving to meet someone she connected with online weeks earlier. Authorities determined she had last been seen on January 15th, 2026, after leaving her residence in Phoenix to meet that individual. Investigators now believe the meeting, arranged through a social media dating platform, had brought her directly to this location. The apartment itself was leased to Randel Basilio Santillan, a 27-year-old man who, by this point, was no longer there. And that detail changed everything. Detectives quickly realized this was not an isolated incident scene. It was the beginning of a manhunt. Evidence showed Santillan had left Arizona shortly after the killing, traveling across state lines, more than 1,000 miles away. Law enforcement agencies began tracking his movements, Coordinating across jurisdictions as the case expanded beyond Arizona, what started as a missing person report was now a multi-state homicide investigation, and the suspect was already on the move. The search would not end in Tolleson. It would end hundreds of miles away, in another state entirely, where authorities finally close in. It didn't end with flashing lights or a dramatic chase. By the time authorities located Randel Basilio Santillan hundreds of miles away, the hardest part of this case was already over. The crime had already happened. The decisions had already been made. What investigators were left with now was the slow, methodical work of explaining how a brief meeting led to irreversible consequences. For detectives, cases like this are built on timelines, not assumptions. They examine messages. They track movements. They compare what was said to what actually happened. Piece by piece, they reconstruct the final hours of Yessenia Gabriella Norman's life, not to change the outcome, but to understand it. Because understanding is the only way cases like this can speak, long after they're over. And what makes this story especially unsettling is how ordinary it began. There was no elaborate setup, no long history between them. Just a connection formed the way so many are today, through a screen, through conversation, through a sense of familiarity that can feel real even when it isn't. That's the part investigators say people often overlook. Not the crime itself, but the moments leading up to it, the small choices, the quick decisions, the trust given without much time to question it. In the end, this case isn't only about what happened. It's about how quickly normal can turn into something else entirely. And there are more stories like this. Cases that start quietly, unfold unexpectedly, and leave behind questions most people never think to ask. If you want to follow those cases as they develop, subscribe to and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Share your thoughts below, because conversations about awareness can help others see what they might otherwise miss. The next story begins with another ordinary moment and ends somewhere no one saw coming.